stalling in the turn, because what's the worst thing that can happen in any of the CPL exercises? It's going to be a stall in the turn, so it kind of makes sense to actually start with that, but it depends on the organisation. This briefing takes us about 45 minutes to an hour, and we'll be exploring many of the concepts and the considerations and the limitations that were introduced in the steep turn briefing. So you see a lot of similarities with that briefing. So this is what we want to achieve today. Very similar to the steep turn. We want to turn maintaining a constant altitude in balance at maximum rate this time through 360 degrees and 180 degrees. So during your training, I'll mix the scenarios up and we will have a look at some turns left and right, 180 and 360 degrees. So what exactly is a maximum rate turn? So we've talked a little bit about what rate of turn was in steep turns. Can you tell me what it is? That would be a question I would ask of a student. So hopefully they say something along the lines of, oh, it's the most number of degrees in the shortest time. There's another click brings that answer up there for you. So far in your training, we have seen rate 1 turns. How long did that take to do a 360 degree turn? Hopefully they remember, I had 2 minutes. Medium turns at 30 degrees angle of bank. Steep turns at 45 degrees angle of bank. What were some of the things that were changing as we had a steeper and steeper angle of bank? And look, they'll probably say, oh yes, steeper angle of bank, more load factor, more drag. What you're really wanting to get to is the steeper the angle of bank, the higher the rate of turn. And this is what one might look like. Here's an example of a maximum rate turn to the left. So what do you notice? It's a bit steeper than the turns you've looked at so far, isn't it? One similarity though, the level attitude is still being maintained. So no matter how steep the turn gets, we should still be maintaining the level attitude because we do want to maintain our altitude. Now, why might we do a maximum rate turn? Why might we want to turn the most number of degrees in the least time? We'll think back to steep turns because it's all the same reasons. So I usually ask that question there as well. So you can just bring up this slide, but another click will start bringing up the answers. So if you actually want to ask them that, then don't click again after the why comes up. So ask the class, hopefully they're able to say avoidance, because it really is. It comes down to practically it is an avoidance maneuver, avoiding cloud, avoiding terrain, avoiding traffic, whatever it is, it's an avoidance maneuver. It's also an excellent coordination exercise. So if we think about it, if we were actually out in the training area and we see something in front of us that we want to avoid, we are going to roll in rapidly to avoid it. But after we've turned 180 degrees or whatever, collisions avoided, there's no need to roll out rapidly. So the varying control inputs, including throttle use, will make this a really useful coordination exercise for you. It's also a good exercise to increase your confidence in operating an aircraft at its limits, both in the clean configuration and with flap extended. As you'll see later in the briefing, quite fine and careful handling is required in order to not cause a stall when we do a maximum rate turn. And it is a CPL flight test maneuver as well. So you will be tested on it. Let's take a bit of a recap on the forces acting on an aeroplane in a turn. So I've just left the straight and level forces up here for comparison, just so we can compare what the forces look like in a maximum rate turn. And let's say again, we're out in the southern training area. We've seen something, we've realized we need to turn very quickly to avoid a collision, and we've rolled into a maximum rate turn. Here's an example of the forces in a turn. In this case, it's at 60 degrees angle of bank, but what I want to point out here is a maximum rate turn is not associated with any particular angle of bank. The forces here are illustrated for a 60 degree turn, but a maximum rate turn could be achieved with a steeper angle of bank or even a shallower angle of bank. and we'll discuss some of those reasons throughout this briefing. So what do we notice here? We're wanting to fly level, so we need that vertical component of lift to remain equal to the weight, but we want the highest possible turning rate, so we need the biggest horizontal component of lift here. How do we get that? By tilting the lift as much as possible with the steepest possible angle of bank, and we also want the most lift possible. The combination of those two things mean this horizontal component of lift will be the highest, and the highest rate of turn is achieved. Take a look at how much lift there is there compared to the lift in straight and level flight. In a 60-degree angle of bank turn, it's twice the lift. Huge increase. So remember, from steep turns as well as the power and flap stalls, we talked about that there's a reaction to that increased lift, the loading. So there's the load factor there. A big increase in the loading, and you'll feel that in this lesson today. Have you ever done one of these with your instructor before? Have they ever demonstrated one? Because often we do as instructors before we even teach this lesson, so they may have actually experienced that already. You could here, if you wanted to, ask some questions around what that does to the stall speed. You don't have to, it's going to come up later on, all right? Now, the steeper that angle of bank goes, the more lift that we will need to fly level, and the higher the horizontal component lift and the rate of turn. So what we want, to summarize what we've talked about so far, is we want maximum lift. And there are a couple of ways that we can get maximum lift. This little formula should look fairly familiar to you by now. Maximum lift is going to be achieved with the highest possible angle of attack without stalling the aeroplane. So we want the angle of attack corresponding to just prior to the critical angle for maximum lift, so approximately 15 degrees. And we want the maximum angle of bank that we can sustain in level flight, so we get the biggest turning force. Thinking back to some of the previous briefings, why do you think we might not want to increase the angle of attack anymore? And hopefully they come back with, oh yep, the stall will happen. Well, that's no good, because the aeroplane A descends when we stall, and B, what happens to the lift? It reduces. So what's going to happen to the horizontal component lift? That'll reduce. Rate of turn reduces. That's not good news if we're trying to avoid hitting something. And this is what I mean when I said quite fine handling is required of the aeroplane in a maximum rate turn to avoid a stall. As you know, another way that we can produce lift is through speed. So why not set an angle of bank that's a bit more familiar and a bit more familiar to us, say 45 degrees, which you're used to, and fly as fast as possible. Here, what you can describe as a roundabout. So imagine a roundabout with multiple lanes, and you're in one car in the innermost lane, and then there's another car in the outermost lane. In 1 minute, which car is going to do the most circles around the roundabout? It's the one with the smaller radius. So the faster you go, the bigger the radius and the smaller the rate of turn. The lesser rate of turn. So if you really wanted to, you could grab this thing out and draw that up. There's another animation you can see there coming up which kind of explains it, but this is another way of doing it. So the faster that speed, the bigger the radius and the smaller the rate of turn. Again, not good news if we're trying to achieve the most number of degrees in the least time to avoid a collision. Another explanation, or another example, I should say, of this. Imagine running up the hallway out here. And you get to where the atrium opens up, and you're wanting to run up the wall of the hallway and then down the side of the atrium. If you're running down the hallway, when you get to where the atrium opens up and you immediately try to turn that way, you're not going to hug the wall, are you? You're going to end up somewhere in the middle of the room. Your radius of turn has increased, the rate of turn has reduced. But if I walk up that hallway, nice and slowly, hugging the wall, I'll get to where the atrium opens up and immediately be able to turn, and I will stay on the wall. So my rate of turn has increased and the radius has reduced by going slower. It's no different than in an aeroplane. Am I going too fast, or is it right? Okay, cool. So this diagram here summarizes what I've just discussed. So increasing the angular bank is going to be far more beneficial than just an increase in speed. There are some times where an increase in speed is actually beneficial. So imagine that you are doing a basic stall and you're right on the fringe of the stall, just about at the critical angle. You suddenly see an aeroplane out in front of you, so you want to turn. But what's going to happen as soon as you turn? You need more lift, but you're already at the critical angle. You cannot get any more lift. You're going to stall. The rate of turn has already reduced to 0. So by flying slightly faster, if it allows you to roll into a steeper turn, there is something to be gained. You might remember when we did turning last semester, I made you do a bit of an exercise to compare the benefit of slow flight at 60 knots with, say, increasing the speed to 80 knots. And we actually proved that there was a higher rate of turn at that faster speed, as well as a smaller radius, because it allows you to roll in more. So if you can roll in more, that's good. So again, to summarize what we've talked about, the requirements for a maximum rate turn. We want maximum lift, we need the maximum tilt and the maximum amount. We want the biggest horizontal component lift corresponding to about the critical angle. And we want the combination of the steepest angular bank with the lowest speed possible to maintain that angular bank. These graphs should be familiar to you. We've talked about the coefficient of lift quite a few times in the previous briefings. And it's probably come up in your PPL studies. This coefficient of drag curve, that came up in the wing drop stalls mass brief, and again you looked at that in your PPL studies as well. So let's imagine we're out there in the training area and we've just established the aeroplane into a maximum rate turn. Where on this coefficient of lift curve do you think the aircraft would be operating? Hopefully they'll say, oh, you're right at the top there, we want maximum lift just prior to the stall. Now how are we going to know we're actually there in the aeroplane? We don't have an angle of attack indicator, so how will we know? Well, today you will hear the stall warning going off during this maneuver, and we use the stall warning as an indicator that we are at maximum lift. There's a particular tone to it that I'll introduce you to today. And the second way that we'll know that we are just prior to the stall is the stick will be quite far aft. It happens that there's a lot of drag there at that angle of attack as well. So what do you think the airspeed will be doing? Oh yeah, it'll be decreasing. And what do you think we might have to do to stop it decreasing? Oh yeah, increase power, which we learned about in steep turns. So now we've learned the principles of flight behind the maximum rate turn. We learned that we want maximum lift. How much lift we can produce is going to depend on a number of limitations, and we're going to spend the rest of the briefing talking about those limitations. So some we touched on in the steep turns lesson, and we're going to expand on them today. So these are the limitations we're going to talk about today: structural, aerodynamic, power, and pilot. When you're presenting this to a student, I like to write these things up on the board, so have the 4 headings, and then underneath them you'll populate it with a bit of data as you go through each section, because that's a good take home for them. later in the mass brief there is a slide or a couple of slides where it does summarise some of that stuff, so it's up to you, but I find it's quite nice to be able to take a photo of that, so I would recommend doing that. Or you could draw a table up, whatever. So let's start with the structural limitations. All we can say for sure about a maximum rate turn is that the angle of bank is going to be somewhere between 0 degrees and 90 degrees. Can't be 90. Could ask that question. Why can't it be 90?
Because there would be no vertical component of lift.
Good. So we would be descending. So that's not going to meet our objectives. So all we can know is that the angle of bank will be somewhere between 0 and 90 degrees, and it does change depending on the number of factors. There are limitations in the flight manual though, and some of these you've already learned about because you're a PPL holder and you've got a type rating in this aeroplane. So there are load factor limitations, G limits. Hopefully this table looks familiar to you, and at the end of this briefing we'll spend a bit of time just going through the relevant sections of the flight manual, remembering where to find this information. So in the normal category, maximum weight 1,200 kgs, the flight manual gives us a maximum G limit of 3.8 Gs, and that corresponds to an angle of bank of 74 degrees. That's pretty steep, isn't it? In the utility category, maximum weight 980 kgs, the max load factor limit is 4.4 Gs, and that corresponds to an angle of bank of 77 degrees. Again, pretty steep. Poor visibility configuration, slightly more restrictive, a maximum of 2 positive Gs with the flap extended, and that's going to correspond to 60 degrees angle of bank, because the load factor for a 60 degree angle of bank turn in level flight is always 2 Gs. So the reason for the more restrictive limits there is because flaps are just hinged surfaces, and when they're extended into the airflow, the aerodynamic force, if it gets too large, could cause damage to them, could cause the hinges to fail. Here is probably where you could have a very brief chat about why there's a bigger load factor limit in the utility category. Do you know the reason why? Any ideas, any theories? Because it doesn't sound right, does
The
it?
actual force being put on the airplane's structure is going to be less for a given load factor.
Yeah, so even though the load factor is bigger, it's the magnitude of the force or the loading per square foot of the wing which is reduced because you're limited to that weight. That's all it is. Just the force per square foot is actually reduced, so the aircraft can withstand a higher aerodynamic force. That's all the detail you need, okay? A sentence or two, that's it. Don't dwell on it. Now you've probably seen this graph, this little curve before, so it shows the exponential increase in the load factor as the angle of bank increases. And what exponential means as the angle of bank increases, the load factor increase gets bigger and bigger and bigger in relation to the angle of bank. So let's compare the figures we've just looked at on the previous slide, and let's plot them on here. So we are in a normal category, There's our 3.8 G limit corresponding to 74 degrees angle of bank. Then we're in the utility category. Max G limit 4.4 Gs, 77 degrees angle of bank. And now poor visibility configuration. Maximum 2 Gs, 60 degrees angle of bank. So look, we've gone, and we've had to go all the way from 0 to 60 degrees to get a load factor of 2. And then just a further increase of only 14 degrees has almost doubled that load factor. By the time we get to 77 degrees, only an extra 17 degrees angle bank, we have more than doubled the load factor. So illustrating that exponential increase. Why do we care about this as pilots? It's because we need to remember that the aircraft has limits. We need to be very careful of how we're handling the airplane and be conscious of what these load factor limits are, because we don't want to overstress the airframe. Overstressing the airframe could cause it to fatigue, crack, or snap. Bad news. So we've got the load factor structural limits, but there's not only that. Hey, what can you tell me about the maximum angle of bank? They should remember that. What does the flight manual say in the normal category? It says no more than 60 degrees angle of bank. You don't necessarily have to grab the flight manual out now, but I would show them at the end of the briefing that it says the max angle of bank in the utility category can be 90 degrees. You still can't do aerobatics, but you are allowed to go beyond it. Do you know why there's an angle of bank limit? Because didn't we just learn that actually we could go to 3.8 Gs, which was 74 degrees? So why is it saying 60? Any ideas? We've got a couple of gyroscopic instruments on board. Go more than 60 degrees and they can topple, and then you lose all reference to what angle of bank you're actually doing. And you've got restrictions. Pull more than 3.8 Gs in the normal category and you can overstress the airframe. How are you going to know what angle of bank you're at if you don't have an attitude indicator? You can estimate it, but that's going to be hard to be very precise, right? So we've got a number of structural limitations, so it's important for us to be aware of those. Another structural limitation, and you should be aware of this, having already got your PPL and being type rated in the aeroplane, is the design maneuvering speed. So you could ask the question, what is that? Otherwise be prepared to tell them. So the design maneuvering speed is the VA, as it's called, is the maximum speed at which we can use full and abrupt control movement without risk of overstressing the airframe. Another click brings up this rather wordy definition, which is why I tend to give them my definition before it. This is something they can take home and read. This is a bit more of a mouthful. So if we are at or below the VA speed and we use full and abrupt movements of the controls, the airplane is protected because it will actually stall before it reaches those load factor limitations we've just talked about. So why is a stall good? Because what happens to lift in a stall? Oh, it reduces. So it unloads the airplane. It reduces the load factor, and this protects the airplane. But if we are above the VA speed and we use full and abrupt movements on the controls, the airflow now being faster has more momentum, and it will not separate before you reach the load factor limits, and so you will overstress the aeroplane before it has a chance to unload itself. The VA speed is affected by the weight. The higher the weight, the higher the VA speed. So a lighter aeroplane has less inertia And if you were to use full and abrupt movements in a light aeroplane, it'll be more responsive. The loading will build up sooner. More aerodynamic force is placed on the structure of the aeroplane, so you're more likely to exceed the limits. A heavier aeroplane has more inertia, takes longer to respond, so the loading takes longer to build up. As a tangent, another point of view by some here is that the heavier the aeroplane, the higher the angle of attack, and so the closer to the stall angle you are. So you take it to an extreme. If we overloaded the aeroplane, so your angle of attack's way up here, if you rip back on the stick, you're going to get to the stall angle before you have a chance for it to actually load itself up. So there's that argument as well, which is a bit, I don't necessarily talk to students about it, but it's helpful to have that as background knowledge. So do you remember what the VA speeds are for the DA40? Oh, yep, good. Go through those, okay? Again, refer to them in the flight manual at the end. Now this might be a little bit new to you, or did you look at that in your, PPL studies or whatever you want to call it. This is the flight envelope. It's for one aeroplane in one configuration at one weight. It shows the areas where we can fly an aeroplane without causing any structural damage or structural failure. And then it shows regions in yellow where we could do structural damage to the aeroplane, fatigue components, crack components, and then the red is where there's structural failure. We've got this positive stall line up here, we've got the negative stall line in red, and we've got the G on the vertical axis and the airspeed. So let's talk about some of the VA speeds and see what would happen in relation to structural damage and structural failure. Let's say we're out in the training area, cruising along at, 98 knots. Suddenly see an aircraft in front of us, so you rip back on the stick to try and get above them before you collide with it. Now we're cruising below the VA speed for this weight, and see how if we draw that line straight up, we're actually going to stall the aeroplane before we reach the maximum load factor limit of 3.8 Gs, which is this black line here if we extended that along. My hand's shaking so I can't draw it very straight, but so we will stall the aeroplane, unload the lift, and this will protect it. But what about if we're cruising at 122 knots? Again, same scenario, aeroplane in front of us, we rip back on the stick without really thinking about it, we're above the VA speed. That airflow now has momentum. It doesn't separate quickly, and we are going to get into this region of structural damage before the aeroplane actually stalls. So we might crack the spars, damage some component of the aeroplane. This is not good. But what about if we're at the VA speed for this weight, 111 knots? This is the maximum speed for full and abrupt movement. So the aeroplane will stall a fraction just before it reaches its max load factor limit. So it will be protected at this speed. So a healthy awareness is needed when we are flying along of what speed you are and what weight you're at, so you know what your VA speed is. We may need to adjust our handling of the controls to prevent overstressing the airframe. A tangent question not to bring up with your students, but why is it that the stall speed of 53 knots doesn't line up with 1G here? Because most other versions of this curve, the 1G will line up with the stall speed. Why has it correctly been illustrated as not that? Any ideas, theories? What happens to lift at the stall?
Reduces.
It reduces, yeah. The actual loading at the stall speed is only about 0.83 G, right at the point where it actually stalls. Because think about the top of the coefficient of lift curve. You know how it kind of starts to round out? It doesn't actually just go straight up and then straight down. So the loading is already starting to reduce when you get the buffer, and that's why it doesn't line up to 1G. because you're not at 1G when an aeroplane stalls. It has already started to unload. So those are our structural limitations, quite a few of those to be aware of. You mustn't forget, if you are drawing this up here, you've got to populate it. You don't want to come back and by the time you're up to power and remember, there's a few more we've got to write up there. It's a waste of time if you do that. Now let's move on and talk about our aerodynamic limits. So as the angular bank gets steeper and steeper, tell me what happens to the drag. Oh yeah, that increases. And what happened to the airspeed? Oh yeah, that gets lower and lower. So what happened to the stall speed? Oh yeah, that gets higher as well. So this data here, you won't find this table in the flight manual. It's been calculated based on the data in the aeroplane. What I want to highlight here is just that for every angular bank, there is a correct airspeed for level flight. And that is what is being illustrated in this table. So for this weight, 1,200 kgs in the poor visibility configuration, we fly around at 80 knots. And let's treat that as our set speed, our target speed, which also means that we can treat it as our stall speed. That speed corresponds to this angular bank of 65 degrees. So what this means to us is that at that weight in the poor visibility configuration, we could, ignoring all other limitations, roll the aeroplane to an angular bank of 65 degrees, and that will be the maximum angular bank to keep the aeroplane in level flight. Go any further and the aeroplane will stall. This is a somewhat theoretical discussion though, because as we've just discussed over here, poor visibility configuration, we are limited to 60 degrees angular bank and 2G. So this is purely theoretical. It's simply to illustrate that for every angular bank, there is a correct speed. And you can calculate that. We're not going to do that, but you guys need to recall the formulas for rate of turn and radius of turn, and actually be able to, and as well as load factor, and be able to manipulate those formulas to prove this, okay? Because you can guarantee when you present this to me, I am going to ask you to prove that those figures actually line up, or prove that 77 degrees angle bank lines up with 4.4G. So have a look back over your formulas. I think in the speaker notes a few slides back it did have a couple of the formulas, but you should be able to find those in your notes from last semester. So that's our aerodynamic limits. There's also power limits. So we talked quite a lot about these in the steep turn lesson. So, and we've just asked you, and you correctly said that as we roll into the turn, that drag increases, so that airspeed reduces. That power sandwich, remember, gets smaller. That stall speed rises. And if the two meet, the power sandwich disappears, we will stall. And again, bad news for us if we're trying to avoid a collision, because now we are going to be descending and our rate of turn has just stopped and or at least reduced dramatically. And when we do the stall and the steep turn lesson, I'll show you that when we encounter the buffet or when we actually stall the aeroplane in the turn, you can see the rate of turn stopping. So I like to point that out to them. So how do we stop those two from meeting? Do you remember in steep turns? Yeah, we increase power. So medium turns, insignificant change to speed or stall speed, so we didn't bother changing the power in the normal configuration. Steep turns, we increased the power a bit, didn't we? And in a max rate turn, we're going to increase the power even more because there's more drag, higher stall speed needs more power. In the poor visibility configuration, generally we'll set full power to minimise the loss of airspeed and the rise in the stall speed. Most aeroplanes, most light training aeroplanes, it is the power that is the overall limiting factor. If you've ever flown Cessnas 152s or 172s at full power, generally the angle of bank settles on only about 60 degrees, in fact sometimes even less than that. That is the maximum rate that they can achieve at typical operating altitudes. DA40, however, we can actually easily exceed that. We've got way more power available to us, better power to weight ratio. So we still have to be limited by these things here, no more than 60 degrees angle of bank. So Diamond have done a marvellous job of designing this aeroplane. Not so Cessna. The last limitation we're going to talk about today is the pilot. Probably actually one of the more important limitations, I would say. You could ask questions here about the effects of positive G, because they would have done their PPL human factors exam by now, and so they'll know the answers to some of these questions. But otherwise, just remember, with increasing positive G, the heart has trouble pumping blood to the brain and to the eyes. And so if we pull too many Gs, it's usually our vision that is affected first. They're most sensitive to changes in blood flow. Got some figures here. They're a bit subjective because it changes from person to person depending on currency and fitness to fly and other factors. But typically at about 3 Gs, this is where we might start to see spots forming in the vision. Go further to 4 to 5 Gs, and this is where we could start getting grey out, so a loss of our colour vision, and even tunnel vision, we lose our peripheral vision. Pull even more Gs, say 6, and this is where we could get blackout, a total loss of vision altogether, followed by G-induced loss of consciousness. So when exactly those symptoms will occur depends, changes from person to person. For you or I, who are not supreme aerobatic pilots, we might start experiencing some of these things maybe even a little bit earlier. It does vary from person to person. So thinking back to these limits over here, if we're experiencing grey out at 4 to 5 Gs, it's quite possible before we even get to these angle of bank, we could be experiencing some of these effects on our vision. So we may not even be able to get to that angle of bank. Pilot factors could be more limiting. So, you've probably got a good idea now from what we've been discussing, but there are some overall limiting factors. Here's a summary of what we've talked about. Overall then, 60 degrees angle of bank is a limiting factor. We have the ability, as you can see back here, from a structural point of view, to get to that angle of bank and that angle of bank without exceeding the load factor limits, but we've still got this 60 degrees to limit us. Aerodynamically, in the poor visibility configuration, we'd be limited to 65 degrees, but again, flight manual says maximum 60. We are not limited by power in a DA40, as with most other training airplanes. And the pilot factors, probably not relevant given that we are limited to 2 Gs, 60 degrees angle of bank. It's unusual for most pilots to experience any of those G symptoms up there at that angle of bank. So here's a table that kind of summarises a little bit more. This yellow box is for the clean configuration, so have a bit of a read of that. I think they were actually meaning to put 3.8 Gs there. So still 60 degrees angle of bank is going to be a limit. Full power is used in the poor visibility configuration. To me, these couple of slides get a bit repetitive, like they say more or less the same things, and if you've already populated that stuff up there, you've already talked about this, so I reckon we're just about to delete these slides, however, not my decision. Okay, let's move on from limitations and talk about aircraft management. So it's important for you to remember the VA speeds, and they are placarded, but also in the flight manual. You should have memorised those by now. A healthy awareness of those speeds and how close to them you are flying is essential. We don't want to overstress the airframe. And this will be relevant even in our flying lessons on this manoeuvre. If we are practicing maximum rate turns in the clean configuration, we will likely be flying above the VA speed. So we may need to modify our roll-in procedure. In the poor visibility configuration, we will be well below VA. In the poor vis config is where we'll spend most of our time practicing these turns. Usually requires full power in order to maintain speed. Not always, but usually. The control inputs, as I mentioned earlier, will vary depending on whether it be the roll in or the roll out. Rolling in typically would be a rapid roll in because we're about to hit something, but after we've turned 90 degrees or 180 or whatever it is, we don't need to roll out so rapidly. And we will practice these with a range of different scenarios, turning 180 degrees as well as 360. Tend to practice 360 degrees initially in your training just to give you a bit more time to become familiar with what the attitude and angle of bank looks like outside. There is an SOP that whenever you're practicing these solo, you should do so at not less than 1,500 feet AGL. I really want you to think of this as an absolute minimum because I would prefer you to be practicing these at altitude, perhaps the same altitude as you would do stalls at. Why I say that is it would be unusual for a student to stall an aeroplane doing a max rate in the clean configuration because your airspeeds are really high. But in the poor vis config, your airspeed is not really high. Especially when they're practicing early on, like it's quite common to mishandle the aeroplane. I think back to my own training and I stalled it several times trying to do maximum rate turns until I got a little bit more confident in practice with the procedure. So that's why I say that. The other thing is if you enter a spiral dive, 1,500 feet, especially in the clean configuration with a high airspeed, is not a huge amount of altitude to actually recover. So for all those reasons, this is an SOP absolute minimum, but best practice, especially early on, to practice at altitude. How did you find steep turns? Did you find them disorientating? High rate of turn, steeper angle of bank, visibility to the right wasn't as good. It's even worse in a maximum rate turn. So start with a prominent reference point and maintain a thorough lookout during the turn to maintain your orientation. So vision, not only is it more difficult to look out because the glare shield forms more of a barrier at these steeper angles of bank, you've got this stuff over here coming into play, these pilot factors. If we are pulling an increased amount of G, say 2G at 60 degrees angle of bank, that means you weigh twice as heavy as you did in straight level flight. It may be more difficult for you to actually move your body around to look around the blind spots to ensure that we are clear of any hazards. And this is very much a visual maneuver, so you do need to keep your eyes outside as much as possible. If a max rate turn was required operationally, sure, it would be a pretty stressful situation. So there should not be any good reason why we need to do a maximum rate turn out of necessity. If we actually have had to do one, then it suggests that we've made some earlier poor decision or not been maintaining sufficient awareness of where we are or where someone else is. We should not have to do a maximum rate turn. Practicing themselves, maybe a little bit of stress is normal because you're operating the aircraft at its limits, quite fine handling is required, but with regular practice, with me on board, you will get more comfortable at these. And worst case happens, you stall in the turn, which we learned last time, or whatever the case is we're going to learn next time. You see why it makes more sense actually probably to start with stalling in the steep turn before you do this lesson. Worst two things that could happen, either they stall or they enter a spiral dive. Both typically happen when you're introducing this lesson. So situational awareness is key, really important. So let's take a look at the air exercise, and we're going to base most of the air exercise off being in the poor visibility configuration because it's not really a maximum rate turn if we are having to limit the angle of bank and power, if we're having to limit the power. So that's what we'll base this off. So it's a bit like a steep turn. It's all normal to begin with. Good lookout, thorough reference point and altitude. And we need to check the speed in relation to VA. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we might adjust the entry speed if we're above VA shortly. It's a coordinated entry, so rolling in with aileron, preventing yaw with rudder. Remember, it's a rapid roll in if it's a real max rate, so quite large inputs required, particularly rudder to prevent that adverse yaw. And we're going to set full power smoothly to maintain the airspeed. We're going to continue rolling in and easing back until we hear the stall warning. And I'll demonstrate to you today what that stall warning should sound like. We lock in the angle of bank at which that occurs and prevent overbanking, making sure not to roll any more than 60 degrees as per the flight manual limitations. Maintaining it. Some similarities but also some differences from the turns you've done so far in your training. We are still going to do a lookout, thorough lookout, and collision avoidance. So we're going to want to spend most of our time actually looking outside in the direction that we're turning. The attitude part is where it changes a little bit. So in a steep turn, if you looked at the altimeter or you recognised that the attitude was low and we were descending, what did you do? You pulled back on the stick, didn't you? Now, what do you think would happen if we do that in a maximum rate turn where we are right on the fringe of a stall? And we're going to stall. So that's no good. So we actually control our altitude with angle of bank. If we see we are climbing, we roll in slightly more. If we see we are descending, we roll out slightly. And we use the elevator to maintain the stall warning in the background. And that'll be how we'll tell we're producing maximum lift and getting a maximum rate of turn. A very brief look at the flight instruments. Things to check, maybe make sure you're not exceeding that 60 degrees angle bank, you're balanced, and you're maintaining your altitude. Very, very brief look inside. And that cycle should be quite rapid. You may find that you only have time to do that cycle a couple of times before it's time to roll out, unlike the medium turn. So the exit, again, some similarities and some differences from the turns you've learned so far. But we always anticipate. Now we are turning at a higher rate. We've got a steeper angle of bank, which means more anticipation required. So that rule of thumb was to start rolling out about half the angle of bank before the reference point. We'll roll it's going to be a coordinated exit. We'll roll the wings level, keeping the aeroplane in balance and reduce the power. These things are done simultaneously in reducing the back pressure. What I find is quite useful, based on my experience, is you think about when it's time to roll out, there's no risk of collision anymore. So it's not a rapid rollout. We don't need to do that. What I suggest you do is when we get towards that reference point, start reducing the back pressure because we no longer need to turn at maximum rate, and reduce the power to maintain 80 knots, and then roll out and balance. I find that that is a much easier way of achieving a clean and smooth exit. If you try to do all of that at once, more often than not, you climb 200 feet in a second. And it's rough. You don't want to be rough on the aircraft. It's not necessary. I generally actually do teach it like that because I find people can do really accurate max rates if they kind of break down the exit like that. So we will practice a few maximum rate turns in the clean configuration because obviously we spend most of our time flying in the clean configuration and not in the pool vis config. So it's important that you are aware of how to do one. The difference here is that we'll be cruising above the VA speed. And if we set full power, we would roll beyond that 60 degrees angle of bank and exceed the flight manual limitations. So that's not good. So procedure, reference point, reference altitude, we check VA, we're going to be above VA, so we're going to amend the entry procedure. We'll still roll in smoothly with aileron and prevent yaw with rudder. But as we pass 30 degrees angle of bank, we'll just increase the power slightly. There's an SOP that's 25 inches of manifold pressure. Don't get too carried away with the power. It's not going to be full power though. Increase the power slightly, ease back until we get the stall warning, and make sure we don't overbank or exceed the 60 degrees angle of bank. So this is what a maximum rate turn to the left looks like, recapping on the photo from earlier on. Very steep angle of bank, very high rate of turn. It's all going to happen very quickly. High G loading, 2 Gs, so you'll really feel everything a lot more in this one. Level attitude's being maintained there. Here's one to the right. Level attitude, steep angle of bank, high rate of turn, high G loading. And the visibility here to the right will be pretty bad as well because the glare shield gets in your way. And that is all. I'm trying to think if there's a video. I think there may be a video in the Mass Brief videos folder. So you could play one of those. So, not such a bad briefing to deliver. CCATs always seem to dread it, but there's not that much new there. Like, you're really expanding on some of the things talked about in previous briefings. So VA, you know, did we talk about that in steep turns? I can't remember if that's a new thing, but they should have some background knowledge of that by the time you deliver this briefing. Load factor limits, they should know about those as well. So do ask those questions. They've talked about power sandwich and load factor, effective stall speed before. That's all been made. Rate and radius has been introduced. Coefficient of lift, coefficient of drag's been introduced. So it's really not bad. Where I think people tend to dig themselves holes with this briefing is too much information. Like, it's very easy to give too much information about the VA speeds and the effective weight and why stalling the aeroplane protects it. Just keep it simple, okay? A sentence or two is all that you need. You're not teaching neuroscience, you're teaching about flying an aeroplane. So write that up there if you want to. I do find that that's a useful thing, and then you can actually skip those couple of slides in the PowerPoint. There's a lot of background knowledge required for you to deliver this briefing, and you can guarantee Jess or I will ask you about that. So like I said, go back and review your formulas, make sure you can use them and manipulate them. Do your reading in the commode book and from your notes from the turning package, and that should be all you need to do. Have a look into the utility category as well. I want you to know what it is based on. Obviously you've seen that it's a 980 kg limit, but I might ask you a few questions around how to practically use that. Could we even use it if it was you and I and a bit of fuel on board? Like, or is even that going to overload the aeroplane? So check your flight manual out or do some research around what the utility category limits are and what they're based on. So probably about 45 minutes to an hour, I would say, for that briefing. Spend 5 minutes